The doors burst open at 4 minutes past midnight, and in the space of a single gasping breath, Harriet Bartlett's entire life was destroyed. Or so everyone would say in the days and weeks that followed, when the story had been sharpened and polished and passed between gloved hands at a dozen drawing-room teas. They would say she had been ruined. They would say the Duke of Canes had been trapped. They would say that the Bartlett family, shameless and grasping as they were, had finally played their most ruthless card. What no one would say, what no one could possibly have guessed, standing in that flood of candlelight on Lord Newton's balcony, watching the Duke's terrifyingly calm face above Harriet's horrified one, was that the only person who had been trapped that night was Harriet herself, and that the man who had done it was holding her hand. Every season, London produced its legends. There were the beauties, of course, the debutantes who arrived from the country like spring flowers and departed in carriages hung with wedding favors, their futures secured in a matter of weeks. There were the rogues, the rakes, the charming second sons who danced too close and promised too much. There were the matchmaking mothers, formidable as field generals, deploying their daughters across ballrooms with tactical precision. And then there was Victor Canes, the Duke of Rosheuvel, and he was none of these things. He was something older, something quieter, something that made the debutantes lean toward their mothers and whisper, and made the mothers pull their daughters gently back. He had been Duke since he was 19, inheriting a title so ancient it had its own entry in 3 separate history books, and a debt so catastrophic it had taken him 8 years of brutal, meticulous work to dismantle. He had succeeded. He had succeeded so completely that the debt was now a legend too, something people mentioned in the same awed, slightly nervous tone one might use to describe a man who had survived a shipwreck by sheer force of will. The Rosheuvel estates were solvent. The Rosheuvel investments were formidable. The Rosheuvel townhouse in Grosvenor Square had been quietly, expensively restored, and Victor Canes had emerged from a decade of work with a cold, unhurried authority that other men spent entire lifetimes attempting to manufacture. He was 32. He was unwed. He had, to the naked eye, no particular interest in rectifying this situation. He attended every ball, every dinner, every musicale he was obligated to attend, and he stood at the edge of every room with a glass of wine he never finished and a polite, impenetrable expression that had come over the years to be described simply as the Duke's face. It communicated nothing. It invited nothing. It ended conversations before they began. 3 seasons' worth of carefully introduced young ladies had tried their most charming smiles on it, and retreated, baffled and slightly injured, to report to their mothers that the Duke was not quite human. This was, as it happened, exactly the reputation Victor had constructed, piece by careful piece, to keep them at bay, while he attended to the actual business of his attendance at these events, which had nothing to do with matrimony, and everything to do with the particular, electric, wholly inconvenient problem of Harriet Bartlett.
He had noticed her 14 months ago. He had spent the subsequent 14 months attempting, with considerable intellectual effort and 0 practical success, to stop. Harriet Bartlett was not a debutante. She was 24, a fact her family mentioned often, with the particular brand of sighing disappointment one might deploy toward a failed investment. She was the eldest daughter of the late Sir William Bartlett, whose title had died with him and whose finances had followed shortly thereafter, leaving his widow, the shrill and relentless Lady Bartlett, to hurl the remaining assets of the family into the matrimonial prospects of her 2 younger daughters, Phoebe, who was 17 and luminously pretty, and Claudia, who was 19 and had once been described by Lady Bartlett herself as at least very biddable. Harriet was neither of these things, and Lady Bartlett had long since stopped pretending otherwise. Harriet attended balls as her younger sister's companion. She sat with the other companions and chaperones along the walls, watching the dancing with an expression of polite, perfectly composed resignation that might have looked like contentment to a casual observer. Victor was not a casual observer. He had watched her long enough to learn that the resignation was real and the composure was armor, and that sometimes when something genuinely delighted her, a wry remark from a friend, a truly spectacular piece of dancing she had not expected, the armor slipped for just a moment, and she laughed with her whole face, unguarded and incandescent, and Victor would find himself gripping his wineglass considerably harder than the situation warranted. She had dark eyes and dark hair, and a mouth that curved with a dry intelligence she was clearly disciplined enough in most social situations to keep under strict control. She wore the same 3 evening gowns in rotation. He had catalogued them, which was the sort of thing he was doing now that apparently constituted his inner life, and she danced with no one, refused offers from no one, because no one asked. She existed in the ton at the precise level of invisibility that suited her family's purposes, present enough to chaperone, inconspicuous enough to cost nothing. He had spent 14 months watching Lady Bartlett treat her like furniture, and her sisters treat her like a convenient fixture, and he had spent 14 months doing nothing about it, because the options available to a duke interested in a penniless companion were precisely what they had always been, and Harriet Bartlett, he was quite certain, would rather burn down Lord Newton's ballroom than accept any of them. He was, as it turned out, correct about almost everything, except the part where he did nothing.
The midsummer ball at Newton House was considered by general consensus the apex of the season. Lord and Lady Newton were generous hosts, indifferent to expense, and possessed of a ballroom large enough to accommodate 300 guests, with room for the orchestra, 3 refreshment tables, and at least 1 spectacular argument near the terrace doors. The chandeliers alone had been written up approvingly in 2 separate society columns. The champagne was French, the flowers were hothouse roses in shades of cream and blush, and by 9 o'clock the room was so warm and so loud and so glittering that it felt, as it always did, less like a party and more like a test of endurance that everyone had agreed to call pleasure. Harriet Bartlett thought it was quite beautiful, in the way that a fire was beautiful, impressive to observe, and thoroughly inadvisable to touch. She was sitting in her customary position along the east wall, between the wife of a viscount she had exchanged perhaps 4 complete sentences with over the course of 3 seasons, and an empty chair that had been occupied until approximately 10 minutes ago by Phoebe, who had been claimed for a reel by a very enthusiastic young man with excellent prospects and terrible rhythm. Lady Bartlett had swept after them with the expression of a woman who had sighted land after a long voyage. Claudia had vanished in the direction of the refreshment table and had not yet reappeared, which Harriet thought said something quite telling about Claudia's priorities. This left Harriet, as it so often did, alone. She did not precisely mind. There was something to be said for the east wall. One could observe the entire room from it without being observed in return, or so she had always assumed, until approximately 6 weeks ago, when she had caught the Duke of Rosheuvel watching her from across a room for the 3rd time in a fortnight, and had been forced to revise her assumption rather sharply. She told herself it meant nothing. She had been telling herself this with increasing frequency, which she recognized with the bleak self-awareness that was perhaps her most consistent character trait, as a sign that she was losing the argument. The Duke was here tonight. She had registered his arrival with the careful peripheral attention she had been deploying toward him for months, never directly, never obviously, the way one does not look directly at the sun, but remains constantly, uncomfortably aware of its position.
He had come in with Lord Thompson at 9:15, spoken to 3 people in the first hour, declined 2 dances that she had not personally witnessed but had been informed of by the Viscountess beside her, who found the Duke's marital recalcitrance a source of inexhaustible fascination, and had been standing near the south windows for the better part of the last 40 minutes, doing absolutely nothing of apparent social value. He was doing it right now, in fact. She was very deliberately not looking. "Miss Bartlett." The voice came from directly beside her, which was impossible, because there was a wall directly beside her, and she had been watching the south windows, not watching, peripheral attention, entirely different, and had not seen him move. She looked up. Victor Keynes, Duke of Rosheuvel, was standing 2 feet away, his expression composed and neutral in the way that had apparently convinced 3 seasons' worth of young ladies he was not quite human, and Harriet felt the distinct, inconvenient sensation of every coherent thought she possessed temporarily vacating the premises. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice, to its considerable credit, came out quite level. "Are you enjoying the evening?" It was the most ordinary possible opening, and somehow in his mouth, with his eyes doing that thing they did, that dark, attentive thing she refused to name, it felt like anything but ordinary. "I find it very warm," she said, which was true. "It is," he agreed. A pause. "Your sister dances well." "Phoebe dances beautifully." Another pause, and she felt obligated to fill it, which she suspected, with a flicker of irritation, was precisely what he had intended. "You do not dance, Your Grace." "Not tonight." "You rarely dance, at any event." Also true. "Society finds it mysterious." "I know," he said, and there was something in his tone, not quite amusement, but the shadow of it, that made her look at him directly for the first time in several weeks, which was a mistake she registered the moment she made it. "Do you not find it useful?" she asked, looking away again at once. "The mystique. If you danced with someone, she'd immediately begin planning the wedding breakfast. Which is, as you have identified, precisely why I do not dance." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, not intimate exactly, but pitched to carry to her ears only, and the shift in register did something deeply unhelpful to her composure. "I have, however, been considering an exception."
Harriet looked at him again. She couldn't help it. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't pass, steady and contained, and somehow, underneath the containment, urgent. "That would cause a great deal of speculation," she said carefully. "Yes, an unattached duke dancing at a midsummer ball, whoever you danced with would be the subject of every conversation in London by morning. Also, yes, that seems an unkind thing to do to someone." Something moved through his expression, quick, almost imperceptible. "It depends entirely on the someone." She opened her mouth, closed it, and chose the most sensible available response, which was to say, "I believe Lady Newton is looking for you, Your Grace," even though Lady Newton was visibly occupied on the far side of the room and looking for no one. The Duke followed her gaze, acknowledged the fiction with a faint tilt of his head, and said, "I hope you will take some air later, Miss Bartlett. The terrace is very pleasant at midnight." He paused. "I have it on good authority that it is the least crowded part of the house." He left before she could answer. She watched him go, not peripherally, not careful, just watched, and felt the east wall suddenly seem very far away from everywhere she wanted to be. That evening, Harriet spent the next hour doing everything within her power to be a model companion, which meant tracking Phoebe's progress through 3 more dances, ensuring Claudia had not made any promises she could not keep near the refreshment table, and deflecting Lady Bartlett's pointed inquiries about whether any suitable gentleman had paid calls to the east wall in Harriet's direction. "No one of consequence," Harriet said, which was technically accurate in the same way that a storm at sea was technically weather. By 11, the ballroom had reached its peak density. By 11:30, the terrace doors were open, the night air drifting in over the dancing couples in warm, rose-scented waves. By 1:45, Phoebe had disappeared with her dancing partner in the direction of the lemonade, and Lady Bartlett had sailed after her with the determined focus that meant someone's hand was about to be angled for. By 5 minutes to midnight, Harriet had decided firmly and finally that she was not going to the terrace. At 3 minutes past, she was on the terrace. She would examine her own reasoning at a later date. The evening air was genuinely lovely. The gardens below the Newton balcony smelled of summer and grass and the faint sweetness of jasmine, and the noise of the ballroom fell away with such relief behind the closed doors that she stood for a moment with her eyes shut, just breathing. It was the balcony that jutted from the far east end of the terrace, private and slightly overgrown with climbing rose, the last place the footman bothered to patrol. She had known it was here because she had found it 2 seasons ago when Phoebe had cried over a young man and Harriet had needed somewhere quiet to let her. It was not unoccupied. The Duke was standing at the railing with his back to her, looking out over the garden, and he turned at the sound of her footstep as though he had been expecting it, which, she thought, with a small, sharp collapse of her careful logic, he had been. "You came," he said. "I wanted air," she said. "This is not a response to your, it is simply air." Of course, he turned back to the garden and said nothing further, which was the most infuriating possible response, because it left her standing there with nowhere to direct her very reasonable objections. She came to stand at the railing, a deliberate 3 feet away. Below them, the Newton Gardens stretched in silver and shadow, the moon high and full overhead. The music from inside was muffled to something soft and lovely. The night was very quiet, and she was very aware of him, of the breadth of his shoulders and the stillness of him, that particular quality of contained attention that she had catalogued, God help her, 14 months of observations ago. "Why did you want me here?" she asked, because she was her mother's daughter in precisely one respect, which was that she refused to pretend ignorance she did not have. He was quiet for a moment. When he turned to look at her, the moonlight did something extraordinary to his expression, stripped the polished composure back to something rawer and more direct, and she felt her pulse do something entirely involuntary. "Because I have been finding reasons to be in the same room as you for over a year," he said, "and I have grown rather tired of reasons." The jasmine smelled very strong. The music played softly. Harriet Bartlett gripped the railing and said in a voice that was almost steady, "You are a duke." "Persistently," he agreed. "And I am a companion." "You are the most interesting person in every room you enter," he said, "which you seem entirely unaware of, and which I find increasingly inexplicable." He took one step toward her, just one, measured and deliberate, and the 3 feet became something considerably less, and the night air seemed to have developed a strange pressing quality. "I am asking for very little, Harriet." She had not given him permission to use her name. She did not at this particular moment have the wherewithal to say so. "What are you asking for?" His voice, when it came, was quiet and entirely sure of itself, the way he was sure of everything, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a weight she would feel for weeks. "Just one kiss," he said, "before midnight. That is all."
It was not all, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. And in the moonlight on the balcony, with the jasmine and the muffled music, and 14 months of peripheral attention suddenly condensed into the small charged space between them, Harriet Bartlett made the single most consequential decision of her life. She closed the remaining distance. The kiss was... It was not what she had braced for. She had expected something controlled, something that matched the careful, composed exterior she had been studying for over a year. Instead, he kissed her the way she suspected he did everything when no one was watching, thoroughly and with absolute, devastating attention, and she forgot entirely about the east wall and the 3 gowns and the reasonable objections she had prepared, and kissed him back with an honesty she hadn't known she'd been keeping in reserve. The balcony doors burst open at 4 minutes past midnight. The light was blinding. The voices were immediate and multiple and comprehensively terrible. Lady Bartlett's particular pitch cut through all of them, high and carrying and already calculating. And Harriet pulled back as though scalded, her hand flying to her mouth, and saw over the Duke's shoulder the assembled faces, her mother, her sister Claudia, Lord Thompson, Lady Newton, and 3 women she recognized as the sharpest tongues in 3 postcoats, all wearing the identical expression of witnessing a social catastrophe. All except Lady Bartlett, who was already smiling. "Well," said Lady Bartlett, into a silence so complete that Harriet could hear the jasmine rustling. "I think we must speak about a wedding." The Duke turned slowly. His face had closed like a door being shut, cool and expressionless and entirely unreadable, and he looked at the assembled witnesses with an expression Harriet could not interpret. Not fury, not panic, not any of the things she felt storming through her own chest. He looked, she would think later, like a man surveying a landscape he had already mapped. "Indeed," said the Duke of Rosheuvel, in the voice of a man who has lost something irreplaceable. "It seems we must." And Harriet Bartlett, who was standing on a balcony with no escape routes and a family who had apparently just destroyed a duke on her behalf, felt the earth drop out from under her entirely.
The morning after a scandal in Regency London was a particular kind of theatre, and it required costumes. Harriet wore hers, a grey morning dress, her second best, her expression carefully arranged into a neutrality she had been practicing since approximately 2 in the morning, when the Duke's solicitor arrived at 11 o'clock sharp, accompanied by Lord Thompson, and a document that had clearly been prepared with considerable speed and even more considerable legal precision. Lady Bartlett received them in the front parlour with the satisfied composure of a chess player who had just taken a queen, and Harriet sat beside her like a piece of furniture, present, decorative, largely unconsulted, and watched the machinery of her future being assembled around her without her having touched a single gear. The terms were generous, absurdly generous, in the way that only the genuinely wealthy could afford to be when making a point. A settlement that would render Lady Bartlett financially comfortable for the rest of her natural life, allowances for both Phoebe and Claudia, and for Harriet herself, a personal income so substantial that it made the solicitor clear his throat twice when reading it aloud, as though the numbers required extra air to survive. "His Grace has been most thorough," said Lord Thompson, to no one in particular. "His Grace has had a great shock," said Lady Bartlett, in a tone that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and triumphant. Harriet said nothing. She had been saying nothing since approximately midnight, which was the point at which the Duke had offered her a formal bow, stated that his man of business would call in the morning, and left the Newton balcony with the measured, unhurried stride of a man who had somewhere considerably more important to be. He had not looked at her as he left. He had not, in fact, looked at her at all after the moment the doors opened, and she had spent the intervening hours constructing and dismantling and reconstructing various explanations for this, none of which were comfortable. The engagement was announced in 2 papers by noon. By 2 o'clock, callers had begun to arrive. Harriet escaped to the garden. It was a small garden. The Bartlett townhouse was modest enough that small was a polite description, and it was a warm afternoon, and she sat on the stone bench behind the yew hedge and felt the full weight of the previous night settle onto her shoulders like a coat made of lead. She had kissed a duke on a balcony, and her family had apparently orchestrated the witnesses, which meant she had been either the most reckless woman in London or the most thoroughly managed one, and she was not yet certain which was worse. She heard the garden gate. She did not look up. "Miss Bartlett?" She looked up. The Duke of Rosheuvel was standing at the garden gate in a coat so perfectly tailored it constituted its own argument for order in the universe, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something careful and intent and stripped of all the usual social armor, and it did precisely nothing to improve her composure. "You are not supposed to call without a chaperone," she said. "Your butler let me in. My butler is loyal to whoever tipped him last." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Almost. "Then I have made a worthwhile investment." He came through the gate and stopped a correct distance away, not ballroom distance, but enough for propriety, and she was suddenly sharply aware that propriety, as of this morning, meant something entirely different between them than it had 24 hours ago. "You did not need to come," she said. "Your solicitor was extremely thorough. I am aware. I wrote the terms. They are very generous, under the circumstances." She paused. "I want you to know I did not know about my mother's plan. I did not know she had arranged for... I would never have..." She stopped, because the sentence had nowhere to go that wasn't either an apology or a justification, and she was disinclined to offer either to a man who was looking at her with that particular unreadable expression. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?"
He said nothing for a moment, which was, she was beginning to understand, his particular brand of evasion, not silence precisely, but a stillness that redirected the question rather than answering it. "Because I know you," he said finally, "as well as one can know a person one has been observing from the east side of various ballrooms." The bluntness of it startled her into something perilously close to a laugh. She pressed her lips together. "You have been observing me." "Persistently," he said, and used the word she had given him last night with such perfect, understated precision that she felt it like a small, targeted blow somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum.
She looked at her hands. "I have ruined your plans," she said, "whatever plans you had, for the season, for a proper match. You'll spend the next year being whispered about and pitied, and I know what that costs a man in your position, and I am Harriet." He said her name, the same way he had said it on the balcony, quietly, without inflection, like a man placing a very important object down very carefully. "Stop apologizing for something that is not your fault." "I'm not apologizing," she said, with more spirit than she'd intended. "I'm informing me that I've been inconvenienced. Informing you that I understand the situation is not ideal." "What if," he said, and his voice had shifted, lower, more deliberate, the same quality it had carried on the balcony, when the night was quiet and the jasmine was too strong. "The situation is precisely what I intended." Harriet stared at him. He looked back at her with his perfectly composed, entirely unreadable face, and then the garden gate opened again, and Lady Bartlett swept through it with Claudia in tow, exclaiming about propriety, and the Duke's expression closed again like a window in a storm, and the moment, if it had been a moment, was gone. But the question remained, lodged in her chest like a splinter, sharp and insistent, and not amenable to reason. Precisely what I intended. She would need to think about that very carefully. She suspected she already knew what thinking about it carefully would cost her.
The engagement was 6 days old when London decided it was the most interesting thing to happen since the Regent's last dinner party, and the Bartlett household became, to Harriet's considerable dismay, a site of pilgrimage. Every morning there were callers, every afternoon there were invitations, every evening there was Lady Bartlett, circling the house with the satisfied energy of a woman who had achieved her life's ambition and was now busily planning the sequel. Phoebe had acquired 3 new suitors in the wake of her sister's elevation, which Lady Bartlett considered a bonus so delightful it almost reconciled her to the fact that it was Harriet, rather than one of the more biddable daughters, who had captured the Duke. Harriet found the whole thing profoundly exhausting. She had seen Victor twice in 6 days, once at a formal call, conducted in the front parlour under Lady Bartlett's hawk-eyed supervision, where they had managed to exchange perhaps 30 sentences, all of them perfectly civil, and none of them about anything that actually mattered. Once at a dinner at Lord Thompson's house, where they had been seated together and had conducted the most genuinely interesting conversation she had had in 3 years, about the agricultural reforms moving through Parliament, the novels of Mrs. Radcliffe, and the precise degree to which Lord Thompson's cook overcooked the fish, and then said good night with perfect propriety, and she had gone home and lain awake until 3 in the morning, feeling, to her absolute fury, like something was missing. This, she thought, was the most dangerous development yet. It was on the 7th day that she found the letter. It came through the morning post, written in a hand she did not recognize, and it contained 2 things. A name she did know, that of Lady Ruth Walker, whose drawing-room served, as any serious student of London society knew, as the clearing-house for its most reliable intelligence, and an invitation to call that afternoon, framed in the politely unmistakable terms of a summons from someone who expected to be obeyed. Harriet went, partly from curiosity, and partly because anything that removed her from the house for an afternoon was, at this juncture, a gift. Lady Walker's drawing-room was everything its reputation suggested, warm, impeccably arranged,
and occupied by a woman of perhaps 60, who had the composed, watchful demeanor of someone who had been collecting interesting information for decades and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it.
"Miss Bartlett," said Lady Walker, pouring tea with the serenity of a woman who never spilled anything, "I have been wanting to meet you. You are, I think, more interesting than you have been led to believe." "That is either a compliment or a warning," Harriet said. "Both," said Lady Walker pleasantly. "Sit down. I want to tell you some things about your future husband." Harriet sat. What followed was 20 minutes of very precisely delivered information: Victor's reputation, his history, his known enemies, and his methods, described with the detached admiration one might apply to a particularly effective and slightly alarming piece of machinery. "He has enemies," said Lady Walker, "powerful ones, men who have been waiting for him to make a match so that they might use his wife against him. He has been aware of this for 3 years, which is why he has not made one." She paused. "He has also been aware, for rather longer than that there was precisely one woman in London he was interested in marrying." Harriet set down her teacup. "I see." "Do you?" said Lady Walker, with the mild interest of someone who suspects the answer is not yet quite complete. "Because the thing about very intelligent men with powerful enemies and deeply held feelings they have no conventional means of acting on is that they tend, in the end, to construct unconventional solutions." Harriet looked at the woman across from her, at her composed, slightly amused expression, at the careful way she had delivered each piece of information, building to this precise point, and felt something cold and electric move through her. "He did not come to the balcony by accident," she said. "No." "And the balcony doors?"
Next morning, Harriet arrived at Rosheuvel House in Grosvenor Square at 10 o'clock sharp, unannounced, having told no one where she was going, and brought only her fury for company. The butler, to his eternal credit, let her in without blinking. She was shown to a study that contained more books than her family home had ever owned, a desk covered in the orderly density of an active intelligence, and Victor Keynes, who looked up from his correspondence as she was announced, and rose with the unhurried courtesy of a man who was, she was certain, not the least bit surprised to see her. "Miss Bartlett," he said, "I was expecting you." "Were you?" she said, not a question. "I understand you called on Lady Walker yesterday. Then you have very fast intelligence. I have very good friends." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk with the courteous certainty of a man who expected her to sit. She sat, because standing would have been theatrical, and she refused to give him theatre. "Did you unlock the balcony doors," she said, "at Newton House?" A pause, just the length of a breath. "The lock was already—" "Did you ensure they would be unlocked?" Another pause. He looked at her across his desk with that expression she had been cataloguing for 14 months, and for the first time she could read it clearly. Not composure, not coldness, but a very carefully maintained structure around something that was neither of those things. "Yes," he said. The word fell into the study like a stone into still water. "And the witnesses. I had a word with Lord Thompson." "Lord Thompson," she said, "who is your closest friend, and who was standing in that doorway at 4 minutes past midnight." "Yes, and my mother was there because she had been looking for an opportunity of that kind for some time, and I provided one." Harriet looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back at her with the stillness of a man who has made his confession and is now, with absolute steadiness, waiting for his sentence. "You orchestrated it," she said. "All of it. Yes. You decided, without consulting me, that the best way to address whatever it is you feel, whatever you claim to feel, was to manufacture a scandal that would remove every choice I had in the matter."
His jaw tightened fractionally. It was the closest thing to flinching she had ever seen him do. "That is one way to describe it." Is there another? I had enemies who would have intervened in any conventional courtship. I had no legitimate means of approaching you. You are not a debutante. You have no formal position in society. You would have refused a direct proposal. I knew you would refuse it. So you decided to make it unnecessary. I decided, he said, and his voice was very controlled now, the way things become very controlled when they are at risk of becoming the opposite, to ensure that you could not be taken from me before I had the chance to show you. He stopped. When he continued, it was quieter. I was wrong to do it without your knowledge. I knew it then, and I know it more clearly now, looking at you. You knew it then, Harriet said, and you did it anyway. Yes. Why? The word landed differently from all the others. He looked at her, and the controlled expression slipped, just for a moment, just enough, and she saw what was underneath it, something private and certain and absolutely undefended. And it was, she thought, with a complex feeling she had no current name for, the most honest thing she had seen on a human face in years. Because you were going to disappear, he said, at the end of this season. Your mother would have taken the family back to the country, or found you some other household to companion, and I would have stood in my study in this house and known precisely where you were, and had no means of reaching you that you would have permitted. He paused. I could not allow that. You could not allow it. No. Harriet sat with this for a moment. The study was very quiet. Outside, Grosvenor Square was doing its ordinary morning things, carriages and vendors, and the distant sound of someone's horse complaining about something, and inside there was just the weight of 14 months of watching and being watched, and the space between them, which felt, she thought, extremely significant. I am very angry, she said. I know. I intend to remain angry for some time. That is entirely your right. And I have conditions. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, she thought, improbably, or the architecture of relief, the way a structure settles when the weight it was built to carry finally arrives. Tell me, he said. I will not be managed. Not by you, not by my mother, not by anyone. If you try to make decisions about my life without consulting me again, I will make your existence so thoroughly unpleasant that even your enemies will feel sorry for you. Understood. I want to know your enemies, all of them. I will not be kept ignorant of threats to my household. Agreed. And I want you to understand, she said, and her voice had changed, gone quieter and more direct, stripped of the crisp structure of conditions, that I went to that balcony of my own accord. Whatever else you arranged, and I am still extremely angry about all of it, I went there myself. That was mine. He was very still. I know, he said softly. I have not forgotten it for a moment. Harriet stood. He stood with her. They were on the same side of the desk now, which had not been the case before, and she was not entirely sure when that had happened. I will honor the engagement, she said, not because my family maneuvered me into it, because I choose to. She held his gaze. Do not make me regret the distinction. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you do not, he said, with the simple certainty of a man making a very important promise he fully intends to keep. She walked out of his study. She walked down his stairs and past his excellent butler and out into Grosvenor Square, and she stood in the morning sunshine and felt, beneath the entirely legitimate fury, something else that she was not yet ready to examine. It could wait. She had a great deal more being angry to do first.
The fortnight that followed was, by any reasonable measure, the most socially intense of Harriet's life. London had decided that the engagement of the Duke of Rosheuvel to the previously invisible Miss Bartlett was its new favourite subject, and it pursued this subject with the relentless, cheerful appetite it brought to all its favourite things. They were watched at every outing, every public appearance was analysed,
Every exchange of words was noted, interpreted, and distributed to parties who had not been present but were extremely interested. This, Harriet thought, was one of the things he had not accounted for. Or perhaps he had. She was still assembling the full picture of what Victor Keynes had and had not accounted for, and the picture was, she had to admit, rather more carefully rendered than she'd initially supposed. He had arranged for her mother to be financially secure, removing at a stroke both Lady Bartlett's motive for further manipulation and her hold over Harriet's future. He had ensured the witnesses included Lady Newton and 3 of the Ton's most reliable gossips, which meant the engagement could not be quietly quashed by his enemies without an act of social war that would cost them more than it cost him. He had prepared the legal terms in advance, which meant the settlement was drafted without Lady Bartlett's lawyers anywhere near it, and the result was a document that protected Harriet, not her family. She had gone back to Lady Walker once more, because Lady Walker, it transpired, had been Victor's closest confidant for the better part of a decade, and was evidently delighted to finally have someone to tell all of this to. "He has been planning since January," Lady Walker said, with the measured satisfaction of someone recounting a very long chess match. "He knew your family would be at the midsummer ball. He knew about the east balcony. He investigated Newton House specifically. He selected the witnesses with care, choosing people whose social standing would make the engagement too established to attack before his enemies could mobilize." "He was remarkably thorough," Harriet said, in a tone of precise neutrality. "He is remarkably thorough about everything. It is one of his most distinguishing qualities." Lady Walker looked at her over her teacup. "He also spent 3 evenings deciding what to say to you on the balcony, which I find, personally, very endearing." Harriet said nothing for a moment. "He told you that?" "He did not need to. I know him extremely well." Lady Walker set down her cup. "You are still angry."
I am moderating my anger in light of evidence. That is very measured of you. I am a very measured person, Harriet said. You are, said Lady Walker, a very brave person pretending to be a measured one, which is considerably more interesting. She paused. He has done everything he could think of to protect you, including things you won't find out about for months. I would not tell you what they are, but I want you to know they exist. Harriet walked home from Lady Walker's house slowly through the afternoon streets and thought about what it meant to be protected by someone who had been watching from the east side of various ballrooms and waiting and finding reasons and growing tired of reasons. She was still angry. She was also, which was rather more complicated, beginning to be something else. That evening, at a dinner she could not avoid, they were seated together again, and he asked her opinion about the new watercolor exhibition at Somerset House, and she had a great deal of opinions about it, and they argued about Turner with a mutual enjoyment so evident that the woman across the table gave up attempting to join the conversation and simply watched with the expression of someone witnessing a natural phenomenon. At the end of the evening, at the door, waiting for separate carriages, he said quietly, "You are less angry." "I am not less angry," she said. "I am the same amount of angry, more efficiently distributed." He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight, and she saw it again, that unguarded thing underneath the composure, the thing that was neither coldness nor control. "Progress," he said, and handed her into her carriage with impeccable courtesy and the sort of expression that made the word feel like considerably more than it was. She was, she thought, as the carriage moved away, in a very great deal of trouble.
3 weeks into the engagement, Lady Bartlett began to cause trouble. This surprised no one, least of all Harriet, who had been waiting for it with the resigned patience of a woman who has grown up watching a tide and knows perfectly well when it turns. The trouble manifested first in small ways. A comment to Lady Newton's sister about the circumstances of the engagement that was repeated with embellishments to 3 other parties. A remark at a dinner that managed with considerable skill to be both a boast and an implication, suggesting that the Bartlett family had, in their wisdom, recognized the Duke's interest before the Duke had fully acted on it and had merely provided the occasion. Harriet heard about this on a Thursday and went directly to Rosheuvel House. Victor was, as she was becoming accustomed, not particularly surprised to see her. "My mother is telling people she orchestrated the balcony." "I know," he said. "She has told 3 people, one of whom told me directly." "She is implying it was her arrangement entirely." Harriet looked at him. "She is also, and I suspect this is the part you care about, suggesting that you were caught rather than that you consented, which means your enemies now have a narrative." "Yes," he was very still. "They do. What are you going to do about it?" He looked at her for a moment. Then, "I had planned by the end of the month to make our betrothal sufficiently evident, in manner, in public, in the kind of detail that becomes social fact, that the narrative of a trapped duke becomes untenable." "You mean you intend to make it appear we are genuinely in love?" "I intend," he said very carefully, "that it should appear exactly as it is." The study was quiet. The afternoon light was long and golden. Harriet looked at the man across his desk, at the familiar, carefully composed face, and beneath it, more visible each time she looked, the other thing, and said, "What exactly is it?" "I think you know," he said. "I would like you to say it." He came around the desk. He stopped in front of her, close, not the 3 feet of their first balcony or the correct distance of their public meetings, but simply present, filling the space between them with his particular quality of undivided attention.
"I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for rather longer than I can convincingly claim was reasonable. I am aware that this does not excuse the method I chose to act on it. I am aware that you have every right to remain angry, and that I have given you no basis for trust that you have not constructed yourself, from evidence, which is the only way you trust anything." He paused. "But I am asking you, in spite of all of that, to let me show you, properly, without schemes, without manufactured occasions, that I am worth the risk." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. She thought of 14 months of peripheral attention, both his and hers. She thought of the balcony, and the jasmine, and the kiss that had not been what she expected. She thought of a settlement drafted in advance, and enemies carefully outmaneuvered, and 3 evenings deciding what to say. She thought of the east wall, and all the reasons he had found to be in the same room as her, and what it cost a man like this to grow tired of reasons. "Show me, then," she said. He reached out and took her hand, properly, not the glancing contact of social necessity, but deliberately, his fingers closing around hers with the careful certainty of someone holding something important, and she let him. Outside, London did its ordinary afternoon things, entirely unaware that something had just shifted irrevocably in a study in Grosvenor Square. Lady Bartlett, 3 miles away, was still talking.
The enemies Victor had mentioned, and Lady Walker had alluded to, and which Harriet had been waiting to understand, made their move on a Tuesday in late July. Their name, it transpired, was Viscount Alley, specifically the Viscount's set of 3 allies in the Commons, his exceptionally well-placed connections in 2 of London's most respected financial houses, and his absolute conviction, held since a parliamentary vote 8 years ago that had gone against him and in favour of the Rocheuvel interests, that Victor Keynes owed him a debt that had not yet been adequately repaid. Harriet learned all of this from Lady Walker, who had sent a note requesting her immediate presence at 11 in the morning, and then delivered a comprehensive briefing over very good tea with the calm efficiency of a military adjutant. "The Viscount has been circulating documents," Lady Walker said, "letters allegedly from a reliable source, suggesting that the Duke deliberately engineered the balcony scandal, not out of any genuine feeling, but as a means of securing an asset, a compliant wife with no social standing of her own, who would be easily managed and would provide no political complications." Harriet set down her cup. "That is remarkably close to the truth." "It is designed to be," said Lady Walker. "The power of a very good attack is that it contains enough truth to be believed. The Viscount knows Victor planned the engagement. He does not know, or does not care, why.
He is using the fact of the planning to suggest the motive was calculation rather than love. And if society believes him, then the engagement becomes a different story. A cold duke who trapped a powerless woman into a convenient marriage, your family's narrative of the balcony and the Viscount's narrative of a calculated duke become one story, and it destroys both of you socially while protecting neither. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Outside, rain had begun, soft and even against the drawing-room windows. What does Victor intend to do? He intends, said Lady Walker, with the careful expression of someone about to say something significant, to ask your permission to tell the truth. Harriet looked at her. The whole truth, Lady Walker said, publicly, at the Chandron Garden Party on Thursday, which is the largest gathering of the season and where half the ton will be present. He intends to make, in essence, a public declaration, not of the engagement, which is known, but of the circumstances of it. His circumstances, what he intended and why.
He would tell them he planned it. He would tell him he has been in love with you for over a year, and that the conventional means of pursuing that were unavailable to him, and so he used the means that were. He would expose himself to considerable ridicule and risk considerable pride. Lady Walker paused. He asked me to inform you first, and to ask you whether you will permit it. Harriet sat with this for a long moment. She thought of the Viscount's carefully constructed narrative, and the way it used the truth like a weapon, and the way Victor had looked at her in his study and said, "I am asking your permission." She thought of what it would cost him, a man who had built his entire social armor on the precise cultivation of the Duke's face, to stand in the Chandron Garden and say, before witnesses, that he had been so thoroughly undone by a wallflower from the east wall that he had spent 3 months planning a midnight scandal. She thought that she was, if she was being honest with herself, and she had always been, above all things, honest with herself, no longer merely moderating her anger. She stood up. "Tell him," she said, "that I will be at the Chandron party, and that he will not be making any declaration alone." The Chandron Garden Party was, on any ordinary Thursday, an extremely pleasant social occasion. This was not an ordinary Thursday. The Chandron family, Lord and Lady Chandron, who had been hosting this event for 11 consecutive summers with the serene competence of people who genuinely enjoyed entertaining, had arranged their garden in the usual lovely fashion, white pavilions and long tables, and a string quartet under the oak trees, and a guest list that represented 300 people who all privately believed they were there because they were interesting and publicly because they were important. By 2 o'clock, the interesting and important had all heard something about the Viscount's letters, because the Viscount had timed his campaign with the particular malice of someone who understood exactly how quickly news moved through 300 people arranged around a garden. Harriet arrived with Lady Walker at 2:30, which was late enough for the ground to be prepared and early enough to matter. Victor was already there. She saw him across the garden, standing with Lord Thompson, wearing the Duke's face with the absolute practiced composure of a man who was, she now understood, preparing to take it off permanently. And when he saw her arrive, something moved through his expression that she suspected he did not intend to be visible. It was visible. She filed it carefully away. She made her way toward him through the garden at a speed that was neither hurried nor dawdling, and the crowd parted for her in the slightly stunned way that crowds do when something has shifted and the people in it have not yet quite established what. Lady Bartlett, she noted with grim satisfaction, was present and positioned near the refreshment table, with the expression of a woman who had come to observe and had not yet established whose side she was on. Claudia was beside her, and Phoebe, and Viscount Alley himself, at the far end of the garden, wearing an expression of studied neutrality that did not quite conceal the satisfaction underneath it. Victor came to meet her halfway. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said.
"You also said," he replied, with the faint private quality of a man sharing something that belongs only to the two of them, "that you would not do this alone." "Then we are in agreement." She looked at him. "Are you ready?" "Entirely,"
He offered her his arm. "Together, then." They walked into the center of the garden together, and the particular quality of 300 people noticing something simultaneously was very like the feeling of standing at the edge of the Newton balcony and making a decision, the world reorganizing itself around a single point of consequence. Victor spoke at precisely the volume necessary to be heard clearly without appearing to raise his voice, which was, she thought, a skill she admired genuinely. He was concise and direct, and he told the truth with the precise, spare honesty of a man who has spent a great deal of time preparing for exactly this moment. And the truth, as it turned out, was both more romantic and more peculiar than the Viscount's version of events. He had watched her from the east wall for 14 months. He had found reasons. He had grown tired of reasons. He had spent 3 months preparing an engagement that would protect her, undercut his enemies, and bypass her very reasonable objections to the institution of marriage in its most conventional forms. He was aware this was unorthodox. He was not, he said, with a directness that produced a sound from the assembled 300 that was something between a gasp and a laugh, particularly sorry about it. When he finished, there was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds, the particular silence of a large group of people rapidly revising their understanding of events, and then Harriet said, into the silence, "He is also, for the record, extremely difficult to argue with." Victor looked at her. The Duke's face, she thought with considerable satisfaction, had entirely departed, and what was underneath it was warm and undefended, and fixed on her with the quality of attention she had been cataloguing for over a year, and it was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "You have managed it on several occasions," he said. "I intend to manage it for the rest of our lives," she said. The crowd found this charming. The Viscount at the far end of the garden did not find it charming, but the Viscount had, in the space of approximately 90 seconds, become irrelevant, and he appeared to understand this, because he left quietly, and no one remarked on his going. Lady Bartlett, near the refreshment table, was wearing an expression of profound satisfaction, entirely untethered from the fact that she had contributed nothing to this outcome whatsoever. Some natures, Harriet thought, are simply impervious to evidence. Phoebe was crying prettily, which was Phoebe's response to most significant events. Lady Walker, behind the white pavilion, was looking at Harriet with the expression of a woman who had known exactly how this would go, and is enjoying very privately being right.
The wedding was set for October. Between July and October, London had opinions about this. London had opinions about everything, but it had especially concentrated opinions about the engagement that had become, through the combined effects of the Chandron garden party, and a story that was considerably more interesting than the one the Viscount had been trying to tell, the season's most popular narrative. There were pamphlets. One of the broadsheets published a rather florid account that Harriet found when she was sitting on the east wall of a different ballroom, waiting for Phoebe to finish dancing, and which she did not show to Victor because she felt his head was not currently in need of any additional contributions to its size. She and Victor conducted their engagement in a manner that was, as engagements went, atypical. He continued to treat her as his equal in intelligence and independence, which she found she appreciated more every day. They argued regularly about parliamentary reform, about architecture, about whether Turner was a genius or simply very committed to fog, and the arguments were the best conversations she had ever had. He introduced her to his solicitors and his estate managers and his 3 most trusted friends. He showed her the Rosheuvel accounts, all of them in their full and considerable detail, because he said, with the plain directness she was increasingly convinced was his most authentic register, she would be the Duchess, and a Duchess who did not understand what she was managing would be a waste of both their time. She began to spend mornings at Rosheuvel House, working beside him at the second desk he had installed in his study, which had happened, she noticed, the week after she'd pointed out that conducting business at the library table was impractical, and which represented, she thought, the most quietly endearing thing he had done for her, and the rhythm of it settled into her life with a naturalness she hadn't been prepared for. He had not kissed her again since the balcony. She was aware of this in the way one is aware of a door that has been left very slightly ajar.
not preoccupying but present, an awareness at the edge of every room they were in together. It had been a decision on his part. She understood that. He had taken enough. He was leaving this particular thing to her. In late September, on a Tuesday evening, they were alone in his study after dinner, Lady Walker having conspired with considerable finesse to vacate the usual third party, and she was reading and he was working, and the fire was warm and the room was very quiet. She looked up from her book. He was watching her, as he always did when he thought she was too absorbed to notice, with the quality of attention she had spent 14 months cataloguing from the east side of various ballrooms.
"Victor," she said. He looked at her. "I am not angry anymore," she said. He was very still. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that the anger was real, and I don't think you should consider it resolved simply because I have elected to—" She paused. "What I am saying is that it exists alongside something else. It has for some time. I would like you to know that." "What is the something else?" "I think," she said, and her voice was very level, and her heart was doing something thoroughly undignified, "that you know." "I would like you to say it," he said, and used her own words back at her with such precise, unhurried certainty that she almost laughed. "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for some months, which I find professionally irritating, given how long I spent being angry about being maneuvered into this situation. I have decided to proceed regardless." He came around the desk. This time the kiss was not on a moonlit balcony with jasmine and an ulterior motive. It was in a warm study on a Tuesday evening in September, and it was thorough and certain and entirely without artifice. And she thought, with the last coherent part of her mind that remained operational, that this was what the first one had been reaching toward. This plainness, this honesty, this being known. When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her with the expression that was still, and would always be, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I would like," she said, slightly breathlessly, "to register that I am still professionally irritated." "Noted," he said, and his voice was warm in a way she had never heard it in 3 years of ballrooms, and it turned out that this was what it sounded like when Victor Keynes laughed. "Harriet, I adore you." "I am aware," she said. "You have been making it quite thoroughly evident for 14 months. And yet it took you this long." "I had conditions," she said. "I still have conditions." "I remember all of them," he said, "and intend to honor every one for the rest of my life." She believed him. This was, she thought, perhaps the most significant thing, that she believed him, not because he had told her to, but because she had assembled the evidence, piece by careful piece, and the evidence was unambiguous. Outside, London went about its September evening without them, entirely unaware that a man who had been growing tired of reasons had finally run out of them entirely.
The wedding of Victor Keynes, Duke of Rosheuvel, to Miss Harriet Bartlett took place on a clear Friday in mid-October at a church in Mayfair that was full to capacity before the ceremony began and had 3 people standing in the doorway before it ended. It was not, by the standards of aristocratic weddings, particularly lavish. Victor had asked what she wanted, which in itself was enough to make it unlike any wedding she had ever heard of, and she had said she wanted it to be real. He had said he could guarantee that above all other things. It was real. The vows were spoken in voices that did not require the acoustics to carry them, because the words were addressed to each other rather than to the assembled gathering, and the assembled gathering understood this, and was on the whole more moved by it than they would have been by any amount of spectacle. Lady Walker wept,
which she would have denied strenuously had anyone mentioned it. Lady Bartlett wept with the satisfied composure of a woman who had achieved her life's ambition and was generously prepared to take full credit for the outcome. Since the outcome was, from her perspective, the elevation of a daughter and the securing of her own financial future, and since neither of these things was technically wrong, Harriet elected to let her have it. Phoebe wept prettily, as was her custom. Claudia, who had, in the 3 months since the Chandran garden party, developed a rather startling backbone and announced her intention to study botany, did not weep, but smiled with genuine warmth, and Harriet thought this was the beginning of something rather better than what Claudia had been offered before. The reception was at Roosevelt House, which was large enough to accommodate the guest list without anyone having to stand in any doorways, and which had been dressed for the occasion with the understated, expensive restraint that characterized everything Victor did. Harriet spent most of it beside him, not because custom required it, not because he kept her there, but because the room was full of people, and the person she most wanted to talk to was the one standing next to her, and she had, over the past 3 months, stopped finding this alarming. Late in the evening, when the guests had thinned and the music had grown quieter, Lord Thompson appeared beside them with the expression of a man who has been patiently waiting for the right moment and believes this is it.
"I want you to know," Thompson said to Harriet, "that I told him in January, when he first explained the plan, that it would either be the greatest thing I had ever witnessed or an unmitigated catastrophe." "And," said Harriet. Thompson considered the room, the flowers, the warmth, the way the Duke of Rosheuvel was looking at his new Duchess with his most unguarded expression deployed at full capacity, and said, "I have rarely been so pleased to be holding a contingency." Victor looked at Harriet. Harriet looked at Victor. "He also told me," Victor said, "at every subsequent meeting that you were going to be furious." "I was furious," Harriet said. "You were magnificent," said Thompson, with great feeling, and went to find his wife. They danced later, when the room had mostly cleared, and the music had become something slow, and the remaining guests had the good sense to arrange themselves at a polite distance. She had told him she wanted him to dance once, at some point, without calculating the social consequences. He was doing it now, with his arms around her and his attention entirely on her face, and it felt, she thought, nothing like what dancing usually felt like from the east wall. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I went to the balcony because I wanted to, not because you invited me, not because of the plan, not because of any of it. I wanted to be there, with you." She paused. "I think I had wanted to be there for rather longer than I was prepared to admit." He looked at her for a moment with the steady, private attention that was hers now, that had always been hers. "How long?" She considered. 14 months, approximately. He was quiet for a moment, and then he laughed, that warm, unguarded sound she had discovered in September and had not yet tired of, and held her closer, and she thought, with the clarity of someone who has assembled sufficient evidence and is prepared to act on it, that this was the best possible outcome of a thoroughly irregular chain of events. Outside, October London was cold and lit and doing its ordinary things. Inside Roosevelt House, the Duke and Duchess danced without calculating the consequences, which turned out to be the finest thing either of them had ever done.
Spring came to London as it always did, abruptly, in the 3rd week of March, all at once and slightly implausible after the long grey of winter. And with it came the new season, and with the new season came the inevitable machinery of balls and dinners and gossip and the complicated, cheerful theatre of society reassembling itself after 5 months in the country. The Duchess of Rosheuvel arrived at the opening ball of the season in a gown that was both exquisite and entirely comfortable, which was a combination she had not previously thought possible and had discovered was simply a matter of having opinions and a husband who listened to them. Her hair was dressed by the excellent Frenchwoman Victor had arranged for her. Her jewels were the Rosheuvel sapphires, which were, she had to admit, very beautiful, and she was aware, in the specific way one becomes aware of these things over a year of marriage, that he had been watching her from across every room for long enough that watching back was simply the natural thing to do. They entered together. The season's gossips, and there were always gossips, it was one of the ton's most consistent qualities, had several things to say. They had been saying them for a year, as it happened. The Duchess was formidable. The Duke was startlingly not cold. They argued in public with a mutual enjoyment that made their arguments look, to the bewildered observer, rather more like courtship than combat, which was broadly accurate. Lady Walker, watching from her customary position near the south windows, had been heard to remark that the whole thing had gone exactly as she expected, which was the closest thing to satisfaction she permitted herself to express in public. The Viscount Ali had, in the intervening year, removed himself from his more aggressive political positions, which those who knew the Duke attributed to a quiet, thorough piece of financial and social maneuvering that had taken approximately 3 months and produced no documented evidence that could be attributed to anyone. The Viscount found other interests. London found other villains. The season went on. Phoebe Bartlett had, in a development that surprised everyone except Harriet, fallen very thoroughly in love with a young barrister from a perfectly respectable family whose prospects were excellent and whose dancing remained, characteristically, terrible. She was happier than she had ever been. Claudia was in Edinburgh, studying. She sent excellent letters. Lady Bartlett, comfortably settled in the house in Kensington that the settlement had provided, had developed improbably a passion for watercolor painting and had produced several pieces of genuine charm that she showed to anyone who called. She had also, which Harriet considered one of the more remarkable personal evolutions she had witnessed, begun to speak about her eldest daughter with something approaching pride. The pride specifically of a woman who has decided, now that it costs her nothing, to take credit for having raised exactly the kind of person who would end up a duchess. Harriet had let her. Some battles were not worth the effort. The war had gone rather well on the whole. On a warm Tuesday in late March, she was sitting at her desk in the Rosheuvel study, her desk, properly hers now, positioned exactly as she had specified, when Victor came in from his morning appointments and stopped in the doorway with the expression that was still, a year into their marriage, her favorite thing. "Lady Newton has invited us to the midsummer ball," he said. Harriet looked at him over her papers. "Have they repaired the lock on the east balcony?" "I believe so." "Pity," she said, and returned to her correspondence.
He came to stand behind her chair and looked over her shoulder at whatever she was reading, which was his customary approach to her mornings, and which she had, very early on, stopped objecting to, on the grounds that it was both impractical and, if she was honest, rather pleasant. "Harriet," he said, "I love you." She looked up at him. The morning light came through the study windows in long, warm bars, and he was looking at her with his most unguarded expression deployed at full capacity, and she thought, as she thought most mornings, that she had spent a great deal of time on the east wall before discovering that the view was considerably better from here. "I know," she said. "You have been making it quite evident for over 2 years. And yet you still look surprised when I say it." "I find it," she said carefully, "consistently affecting, despite having assembled overwhelming evidence of its sincerity." She paused. "It is professionally irritating." He kissed her, without manufacturing any occasions, without calculating any consequences, without any scheme beyond the simple and sufficient fact of her, and she kissed him back with the honesty she had long since stopped keeping in reserve. Outside, London was having its spring morning. Inside,
The Duke of Rosheuvel and his Duchess were conducting their marriage with exactly the mutual, well-matched stubbornness they brought to everything else, which meant they were, on balance, the happiest people in Grosvenor Square. The east wall of every ballroom in London remained, as it had always been, an excellent place from which to observe. It was, they both agreed, a particularly fine place to start.